she is as core to the history of Google as anyone. It's really hard to get our arms around really the extent of her impact there, Mark.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, it all starts with literally her garage, right? She kind of famously lent that out to Larry Page and Sergey Brin in 1998, and they formed the company there. She joined shortly thereafter. It was sort of this quiet presence. I had sources that told me that kind of one of her nicknames inside the company was like the mini CEO, because there was this leadership she was one of these leaders that basically ran a lot of these operations and management for the founders were sort of famous for neglecting that at the time, right? They were sort of the visionaries, and Eric Schmidt that kind of came in as the adult, and she was responsible for building out a lot of its core advertising business, and that was one of the main reasons that she was brought over to YouTube in 2014.
Mark, she announced plans to leave YouTube in February of 2023 and talked about other projects focusing on her health, but I don't think at that time she or the company elaborated on why. The main point being that she had a profound impact on YouTube. You've written about it in your book. What are kind of the key actions she took during her time as CEO and a leader there?
Yeah, one of her key priorities was to really spotlight the creators. And I think even, this is 8 years ago now, or sorry, 10 years ago now, and this idea this nascent idea of influencers, of online creators, it still wasn't really proven as a business. And I think we can certainly say that that's changed dramatically. Like, one of their initial campaigns was to actually kind of spotlight a lot of these homegrown creators. For a long time, YouTube tried to get celebrities to come onto the platform. I think the shift when Wojcicki took over was, hey, we have our own kind of A-list style celebrities right here, these homegrown YouTube stars. Of course, as we've covered a lot, that has its share of problems, right? The brand safety issues that she dealt with over the tenure. I think that the focus on advertising, sort of her core strength, has paid off in the extent that YouTube is becoming this dominant advertising platform. The other areas that it's no longer, it's dropped its plans to compete with Netflix and Amazon Prime. It's still kind of a YouTube Music is a service, but it's nowhere close to Spotify. I think her legacy is primarily going to be building out that what is still remains Google's core business. And at the time she took over, there were still questions about could YouTube turn a profit. And now it's obviously one of the key pillars of Google and Alphabet's growth.
Mark, while making a profound impact at Google, she made a profound impact for many women in technology. And I know that many have spoken about the way she tried to show up as someone who had some sort of work-life balance, dropping her kids at soccer in a minivan, taking that maternity leave, speaking out about it, Mark. But how else have colleagues, have former people who've worked alongside her, sat on boards with her, thought about her and her loss?
Not just taking the maternity leave, I think she's widely credited for actually forming it at Google. The founders didn't really think about that when they created the company. So it was the first one to actually write that policy and to take it. I think this is certainly the women I've talked to there. This is like clearly a strength of her leadership, being out there very publicly as a mom. I think it's really interesting to contrast her with Sheryl Sandberg and Marissa Mayer, her peers that certainly had a much bigger public profile. And I think Susan Wojcicki, from what I understand, personally didn't want that high public profile. And maybe for Google strategically, it's actually been quite important. I would argue, like that it's not like Elon Musk and X. It's not like Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. You don't have this one executive well known for this platform. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why YouTube has, in many ways, dodged some of the criticisms that other social media sites have dealt with. There's some people that come out and argue that's because Susan is a more sort of astute and mature leadership. And perhaps it's also because she just had this background role. She was not a public profile.